Imagine this for a second. You are handed the keys to a country that is, well, it's actively falling apart.
Hmm.
Your job is to save it from total collapse, guide it through the absolute darkest, bloodiest storm in its history, and somehow pull off a victory that, redefines the nation forever.
It's an impossible job description.
It is, and you do it. You do all of that, and then you're assassinated 5 days later.
It's a tragedy of, almost Shakespearean proportions. And when you look at the American Civil War, that paradox is right at the center of it.
Right.
You have this incredible, preservation of the Union, the second founding of America, but it came at a cost that is just almost impossible to wrap your head around.
That cost is the first thing that really jumped out at me when we were looking at the material for this deep dive. We are talking about a level of violence that killed more Americans than any other war in U.S. history.
Staggering.
More Americans died in the Civil War than in World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, all combined, up until Vietnam.
It's an unbelievable statistic. And today we're going to try and unpack how that happened. We are doing a deep dive into a really engaging breakdown from the creator agent Flappy titled The American Civil War Explained in 24 Minutes.
And what I really like about the source is that it's not just a dry list of dates and battles. It really hones in on the human element, the grit, the huge blunders, and those specific, turning point moments, those moments where things could have gone a totally different way if one person had just made a slightly different call.
Exactly. It frames the war not just as some political dispute, but as a clash of personalities. But before we even get to the first shot, we have to understand the world these people were living in.
Yeah.
The source calls the United States in 1860 a powder keg.
And it really was. It wasn't just that the North had factories and the South had cotton.
Yeah.
By 1861, these are basically two different worlds living under one flag. You had the North just rocketing toward the future with industry, big cities, railroads, and then the South, which was this huge agrarian empire powered by cash crops and, crucially, the labor of 4 million enslaved people.
And that economic divide created a political nightmare. The source points out that this wasn't just about, having different economies. It was a fight over the future of America itself.
And every time a new territory wanted to join the Union, it became this massive fight.
A total cage match. Is it going to be a free state or a slave state?
Because whoever had the most states controlled the Senate.
Precisely. If the South lost that balance of power in Congress, they knew their entire system and the institution of slavery it depended on was on a countdown. For decades, presidents were just like slapping duct tape on the problem.
Yeah, you had the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850.
Just these makeshift solutions to keep the whole thing from sinking.
But by 1860, the duct tape was gone. And the catalyst for the whole explosion was a guy who, frankly, did not look like a president, Abraham Lincoln.
Lincoln is such a fascinating figure in this account because he's not presented as, the marble statue we see in Washington.
Not at all.
He came from the dirt.
Yes.
Literally. The source emphasizes this. Born in a one-room log cabin, his mother died when he was 9. He had less than a year of actual school.
And there's that great story where he apparently walked for miles just to return 6 cents to a customer he'd overcharged.
That one little story tells you everything about his character. That Honest Abe thing wasn't just marketing. But to the South, his election was an existential threat because he was openly against expanding slavery into new territories.
So Lincoln wins the election, doesn't carry a single Southern state, and the South basically says, all right, game over. South Carolina secedes before Lincoln can even move into the White House.
And then they just start to fall like dominoes. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. They form the Confederate States of America.
And just like that, Lincoln isn't just a new president, he's the leader of a broken country.
Which brings us to the first big crisis, Fort Sumter.
And I love the analogy the source uses here because it makes Lincoln's strategy so clear. He's in a bind. Sumter is a Union fort, but it's sitting in a Confederate harbor in South Carolina, and it's running out of food.
Right. If he sends in the army, he's the aggressor. He starts the war.
But if he just abandons it, he looks weak. He's basically saying the Confederacy is legitimate.
So he picks this brilliant third option that puts the ball right back in their court.
He tries to send just food, beans, and bread. The source calls it the DoorDash strategy to avoid a war.
Yeah. He's basically saying, look, I'm just feeding my hungry man. If you fire on a food delivery, that's on you.
But the South wasn't interested. General P.G.T. Beauregard orders the attack. They bombard the fort for 34 straight hours.
And here is maybe the wildest fact from the start of the war. After 34 hours of cannon fire, 0 people died.
It's incredible.
A miraculous, strange little anomaly, especially considering what was about to happen. It was basically a bloodless fireworks show. But that silence didn't last. Lincoln calls for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, and this backfires big time.
Right, because calling for an invasion force pushes the states that were still on the fence right over the edge. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina all joined the Confederacy.
And losing Virginia was a massive, massive blow for the Union.
It wasn't just the land, it was the talent. Virginia's secession handed the Confederacy its greatest weapon, Robert E. Lee.
The source really highlights the tragedy of Lee here. We just think of him as the face of the Confederacy. But Lincoln actually offered Lee command of the entire Union Army first.
Wow.
He did. And Lee was torn up about it. He was against secession. He even called slavery a moral and political evil. But back then, loyalty to your state often came before loyalty to your country.
He couldn't fight against Virginia.
He couldn't draw his sword against his home. So he turned Lincoln down, and the South gets one of the greatest military minds in history.
And yet, even with Lee on their side, everyone in the North seemed to think this would all be over in a few weeks. You know, home by Christmas.
Oh, the delusion was rampant.
Mhm.
But the reality check came very, very quickly at the First Battle of Bull Run.
The picnic battle, this image is just so wild to me. You have civilians from Washington, D.C., congressmen, their families, riding out in carriages with picnic baskets to watch the battle.
They thought it was a spectator sport.
They expected a show, but what they got was a slaughter. The Union was actually pushing at first, but then they ran into a brigade led by Thomas Jackson.
There stands Jackson like a stone wall.
And Stonewall Jackson held the line, the Confederates counterattacked, and the Union Army just broke. It was a full-blown panic.
I mean, you had soldiers just fleeing, running into the civilian carriages that were also trying to flee. It was total chaos.
And that moment really killed the innocence of the war. But while all this mess was happening in the East, out west, a very different kind of general was starting to make a name for himself. Ulysses S. Grant.
Grant is the perfect opposite of all those polished, aristocratic generals back east. The source describes him as quiet, rumpled, always chewing on a cigar, and just relentless.
Unconditional surrender, Grant. I love that. When a Confederate commander asked for terms of surrender, Grant just replied, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender."
He wasn't there to play games. But even Grant got a brutal lesson in what this war was really going to cost at a place called Shiloh.
Shiloh was a nightmare, a huge surprise attack by the Confederates. The Union lines were buckling, they were getting pushed back to the river. Most generals would have retreated.
But not Grant. He just held on, waited for the storm to pass, got reinforcements overnight, and counterattacked at dawn. He won.
He won, but the cost was
23,000 casualties.
It's hard to even picture that number.
Well, to put it in perspective for you, that one battle had more casualties than all previous American wars combined. The Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, add them all up, and Shiloh was worse. That's when America realized this wasn't going to be some quick adventure. This is going to be a grinder.
So you've got Grant fighting this hard war out west, but back east, Lincoln is stuck with a general who is, let's just say, the opposite of Grant, George McClellan.
McClellan. The source calls him Napoleon 2.0. He was young, brilliant on paper, fantastic at organizing troops. But he had one fatal flaw. He was terrified of risk. He loved his army so much he was afraid to actually use it.
It got so bad, Lincoln sent him that famous note, "If you don't want to use the army, I would like to borrow it for a while."
Lincoln was just desperate. Lee was running circles around him. But then we get one of those moments where truth is stranger than fiction. The Lost Orders.
It sounds like a movie plot. A Union soldier finds 3 cigars just lying in a field, and they're wrapped in a piece of paper that turns out to be
Lee's entire battle plan. It gave McClellan the whole playbook. He knew exactly where Lee's army was and how it was divided, and that intelligence led directly to the Battle of Antietam.
the single bloodiest day in American history. The descriptions in the source are just horrifying. You have this one area, the cornfield, that changed hands 15 times in a few hours.
And Bloody Lane, a sunken road where the bodies were stacked 3, even 4 deep. Now, tactically, the battle was basically a draw. McClellan, true to form, let Lee retreat. But strategically, it was a massive victory for Lincoln.
Because it gave him the political cover he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation.
Exactly. And we should clarify this because the source makes a really good point. The proclamation didn't technically free anyone in the South right away.
Right. Lincoln had no authority there.
But what it did was change the purpose of the war. It wasn't just about preserving a map anymore. Now it was about human freedom.
And that was a huge geopolitical move.
Oh, massive. Britain and France, who needed Southern cotton, were thinking about supporting the Confederacy. But once Lincoln made the war explicitly about ending slavery, Europe couldn't touch it. They couldn't be seen supporting a slave nation.
Plus, it allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army, and nearly 200,000 did. So the stakes are way higher. And that takes us to 1863, the turning point.
Two massive events happening at almost the same time. Gettysburg in the east and Vicksburg in the west.
Let's start with Gettysburg. Lee invades the North again, looking for that one knockout blow. And on the second day, the whole war basically comes down to a rocky hill called Little Round Top.
Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine. They're holding the very end of the Union line. If they break, the whole army could collapse. They fight and they fight until they are literally out of ammunition.
So Chamberlain does the only thing he can. He orders a downhill bayonet charge.
It's insanity. It shouldn't have worked. But the sheer shock of it caused the Confederates to break and surrender.
But Lee, he just refuses to accept that he can't break the Union line. So on the third day, he orders Pickett's charge.
The last great gamble.
Yeah.
12,000 men marching across a mile of open field into cannons and rifle fire.
The source mentions this one specific detail about General Armistead. He actually makes it to a Union cannon, puts his hand on it, turns to rally his men, and realizes he's completely alone.
The charge was annihilated. Lee rides out to meet the survivors. He's crying, saying it's all my fault. His army never really recovered its offensive strength after that.
And while that's happening 1,000 miles away, Grant is trying to crack the fortress of Vicksburg on the Mississippi. And he does something the source calls borderline insane.
Vicksburg was impregnable. So Grant decides to run his gunboats right past the Confederate cannons in the middle of the night. At 2 a.m., it's a huge risk.
A huge risk, but it works. They slip through in the darkness. He surrounds the city, and the siege begins. It's brutal. The people inside are eating mules, dogs, even rats.
They finally surrender on July 4th, 1863, the day after Gettysburg ends.
The symbolism is incredible.
The combination of Gettysburg and Vicksburg really sealed the Confederacy's fate.
But the fighting.
The fighting was far from over.
Which brings us to the final grinding phase of the war. Lincoln finally brings Grant out east to take command of everything. And Grant's strategy is simple and it's brutal. Don't stop.
It was a whole new kind of war. Grant did the grim math. He knew he had more men, more supplies than Lee. He could replace his losses. Lee couldn't. So he just decided to engage Lee in continuous, nonstop contact.
The source describes the fighting in the wilderness. It was so intense in the forest that muzzle flashes were starting fires that burned the wounded.
And at Spotsylvania, the gunfire was so concentrated for hours on end that it literally cut down a 22-inch thick oak tree. Just bullets.
Grant was losing thousands of men. At Cold Harbor, it was 7,000 Union casualties in under an hour. The newspapers in the North started calling it the Butcher.
They hated him for it. But Lincoln defended him. He famously said, "I can't spare this man, he fights."
Lincoln knew Grant was the only one willing to do the ugly work to finally end it.
And while Grant is pinning Lee down in Virginia, he unleashes his top general, William Tecumseh Sherman, on Georgia. And Sherman introduces the concept of total war.
Sherman is a terrifying figure. He believed that to end the war, you had to break the enemy's will to fight, not just their army. He said, "War is cruelty. There is no use trying to reform it."
So he takes Atlanta, a victory that pretty much guaranteed Lincoln's re-election, and then he just vanishes into the countryside on his march to the sea.
A 60-mile-wide path of destruction. They tore up railroads, burned infrastructure, seized food, and liberated thousands of slaves as they went. He wasn't just fighting an army, he was dismantling the Confederacy's ability to even function.
He eventually wires Lincoln and offers him the city of Savannah as a Christmas gift.
By 1865, it's all collapsing. Richmond, the Confederate capital, finally falls. And in a final tragic irony, the Confederate government sets fire to their own warehouses as they flee, and the fire burns down most of their own city.
The end finally comes at a little town called Appomattox Courthouse. And the visual the source describes is so powerful. You have Grant showing up in a mud-stained uniform looking like a private.
And then there's Lee in his absolute finest dress uniform, buttons polished, surrendering with dignity.
And Grant, who holds all the cards, is incredibly generous. He doesn't want vengeance.
No, not at all. He lets the soldiers keep their horses for the spring planting. The officers get to keep their sidearms. No one's going to be tried for treason.
And when Lee mentions that his men are starving, Grant immediately sends 25,000 rations over to the Confederate camp. There's a moment as Lee rides away, the Union soldiers start to cheer, but Grant stops them.
He tells them, the rebels are our countrymen again.
It feels like that's where the story should end. Fade to black, a nation reunited.
But history had one last cool twist.
The assassination. Just 5 days later, Lincoln goes to Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth. It is the ultimate tragedy of the whole story.
The source puts it so well. It says Lincoln guided the country through the fire. He struck the chains off 4 million people, but he died before he could see the promised land.
And what's left is the legacy. Over 600,000 dead. The old version of the United States was completely destroyed.
But, as the source argues, it gave the country a second chance.
A chance to actually live up to that ideal from the founders, that all men are created equal. We certainly didn't get there overnight. Reconstruction was a mess, but the war made that path possible.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
So here's something I want you, the listener, to think about as you go about your day. The source highlights Lincoln's whole approach, malice toward none. If he had lived. If the man who saved the Union had been the one to guide the healing of the Union, how different might America look today compared to the chaotic, messy Reconstruction we actually got?
That is the great what if of American history.
Thanks for diving in with us.
See you next time.